The annoying thing about the Old Testament is just how utterly boring and terribly unrelatable it is. This morning, for example, our text is about events that happened 2,900 years ago, about as far as you can get on this planet from Dallas, Texas. What can it possibly have to say to us here in the 21st century? For example, here are a few things that are in our passage or immediately before or after them from the Old Testament. We see the aftermath of armed conflict between Israel and one of its neighbors. We see travel has slowed due to severe political infighting in one of the great nations of the West. And we see in our text today a debate over how to best control disease. Utterly unrelatable to our world, right? Naaman, we are told, is the commanding officer of Syria's best regiment. At this point in history, call it roughly 800 years before Christ, the political infighting within Israel had grown so intense, they divided and broke into two distinct nations. This dividing of the kingdom, Israel in the north with the capital city of Samaria, and Judah in the south with the capital city of Jerusalem, is painted all throughout the rest of the Old Testament as an absolute disaster. And the events that follow this internal fracture play out like a geopolitical soap opera. Now, one of those events had already occurred right before our reading began. Israel, the northern kingdom with Samaria as its capital, had been invaded by a number of foreign armies, including the Syrians, who Naaman led. And at that time, some of the northern Hebrew women were forced to intermarry with the invading armies. Others were taken away as slaves. Now, Naaman, we are told at the beginning of this story, was in favor with the king of Syria because of his military success against the people of Israel, a conflict during which Syrian warriors took some of the Israelite women home as slaves. So, this is where our story picks up. Naaman, the commander of the Syrian army, suffers from a rare but powerful skin disease. Word of this disease, no doubt, begins to spread throughout the city, and eventually, an Israeli slave girl who works for Naaman's wife catches wind. And she has some surprising news. There is a man in Israel, just on the outskirts of the capital city of Samaria, who can help Naaman with his skin disease. Now, this is surprising news on at least two fronts. First, it's surprising to Naaman that anything useful can come from this once great but now divided kingdom of Israel. It's surprising that someone in Israel could cure leprosy. But what is significantly more surprising is that someone in Israel would cure this particular leprosy, the leprosy of the commander of the invading Syrian army. So, why would this servant girl even make this suggestion? She's a slave in Naaman's household because she was taken away from her home on one of Naaman's military raids, and now she's offering to help. Naaman, no doubt, has these thoughts in his mind too, but he is desperate enough to try just about anything, so he sets out for Israel, this time in search of healing and not conquest. Now, here's where your bulletin reading, which might be helpful to have out, here's where our bulletin reading skips a crucial detail. So you'll notice if you look at the reference, a few verses from this passage have been cut for time, so to say, by the lectionary. We do this sometimes, we have to, so we're not reading way too much. But we need to fill in the gap of those verses this morning, or none of it makes sense. So the servant girl told Naaman that there's a prophet named Elisha who lives back in Israel who can help with this leprosy. And Naaman's next course of action is not in your bulletin. Between verse 3, where we cut off, and verse 7, where we pick up, Naaman first decides to travel to the king of Israel's palace. He was told, visit a prophet on the outskirts of Samaria. What Naaman chooses to do is, with his horses and chariots, travel to the king's palace. He was told that this prophet could heal him, but he skips over the prophet. Why? He skips over the prophet to go straight to the king because Naaman is important. Like talking on a cell phone in a convertible on the highway, important, right? He is a big deal. You should see his LinkedIn profile, right? And if Naaman is going to receive a gift, or to use an older word for gift, if Naaman is going to receive grace, he's going to receive it from the top dog, king to commander, man to man. So he travels to the king's palace, and it doesn't go well. The king is terrified when Naaman shows up. The king knows he can't heal anybody, and he is worried that Naaman is going to invade again because of his lack of healing. So where we pick back up, the detail that somehow made the cut is that the king has torn his clothes off out of this fear of what Naaman is going to do. When Naaman finally swallows his pride and comes to his senses and travels to Elisha's home, Elisha doesn't greet him. Elisha sends a servant out to say, go dip 7 times in the Jordan River and you will be healed. Now, this sets Naaman off again. He's beside himself. Just when you think he's learned his lesson about what you miss out on life by being Mr. Important, it flares up again. And he goes on a little rant that you can read about. Why would I dip in the Jordan River? Any river in Syria is 10 times better than this river. What are we doing here? Now, Naaman's servants come to the rescue with one of the most underrated lines in the whole Old Testament. As Naaman is still on his high horse about this strange request to dip into the water, and while he's complaining about the water quality in Israel, his servants ask him a simple, pointed question. Father, they say, if the prophet had commanded you to heal yourself by doing something difficult, would you not have done it? See, they see right through Naaman. If the prophet told him to slay 100 armed men with a toothpick, Naaman would have jumped on board. If the prophet sent him on an impossible rescue mission after which he could be healed, Naaman would have been front in line. Why is it so hard for you, his servants say, to receive a simple gift to save your life? Now, in the life of the world to come, I would like to ask Naaman what he was thinking as he's hearing these questions from his servants. How did he change his mind? Was he ashamed enough of his leprosy to finally give up and try anything? Sometimes this is how people finally receive the grace that changes their life. Did he begin to reason his way towards a clearer vision of reality? Did he somehow be able to explain to himself how receiving this grace might make the most sense? Sometimes that's true of people as well. Or did something entirely outside of him overtake him in a powerful way that he could not deny? We don't know how Naaman changed, but we know this. Naaman walked down to the river and he immersed himself. The Greek translation of this Hebrew Old Testament passage says he baptized himself 7 times in the river, and he left changed. Now, what Naaman says when he comes out of the water the last time is astounding, because it comes from somebody who was raised in the ancient Near East. In the ancient Near East, the one thing you knew for sure to be true about the world is that there are countless gods. They are constantly at war with one another. They sometimes tie themselves to specific lands so that the gods of Syria are in conflict with the gods of Egypt who are in conflict with the gods of the Greeks. Your fate as a human was tied to the emotional state of any one of these numbers of gods who could, with the flick of a wrist or the snap of a finger, look upon you with favor or disgust. This is simply the way the world worked according to the mindset Naaman grew up with. And as a Syrian, Naaman would have never encountered anything other than that approach to human life in the hands of a pantheon of gods. And yet, listen again to the words uttered by Naaman as he comes out of the river. Now I know, says Naaman, that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. I don't think it was the healing itself that changed Naaman's mind. I don't think it was the relief of having suffered and then finally having seen the source of that suffering end. I think it was something deeper. It had to have been something very deep that allowed him in an instant to forget all that he thought he knew about the relationship between gods and men and to flip it on its head. I think Naaman was raised in a world where being top dog is what mattered most. A world in which he was taught that only the strongest will survive, that exterior appearances are to be maintained at any cost, and that power and performance and reputation are the only real currencies in life. And in his baptismal encounter with God, through the prophet Elisha, he learned that all of that was a farce. That depending on others, that ultimate dependence on God himself is the way to the good life. That only unlikely candidates for grace can ever truly receive it. And I think in that moment, Naaman felt a lifelong burden of earning his keep lifted in those waters, and he was changed forever. I mentioned that our lectionary readings for today left out this really crucial detail, and I wish they didn't, but I do have to give credit to the lectionary. Because the gospel reading paired with today's Old Testament passage leaves for us a series of breadcrumbs to follow with our holy imagination. There's a single word in the gospel passage that, when read alongside the story of Naaman, opens our minds to seeing the impact that a single act of God's grace, received with gratitude, can have for generations. Jesus encounters 10 people who are also suffering from leprosy, and without much fanfare, he cures them all simply by telling them to walk towards the temple. The point of the passage is for us to ponder the fact that only one of the 10 lepers turned and thanked Jesus for this gift of healing. Only one of them, in that sense, is a model of what a faithful response to the grace of God looks like. But this is where the passage is undone. It's where the entire story flips on its head in a single word. See, Luke goes out of his way to tell us that the one leper who turned back to thank Jesus was a Samaritan. And do you remember that during that time in Israel, when they were at war with themselves, foreign armies would invade and force intermarriage between attacking men and Hebrew women? The Samaritan people are the descendants of those intermarriages. If your ancestors were Hebrew women who were forced to intermarry with Assyrians or Babylonians or Egyptians, you are called a Samaritan. And to the rest of the Jewish people in Jesus' day, they are an absolute disgrace. These Samaritans are living icons, living reminders to the senses of those centuries of disobedience to the Torah, of those centuries of infighting and invasion, and the mere sight of a Samaritan was repulsive. A good Jewish family would not associate with those people. Now, 8 centuries after the story of Naaman, there was at least one Samaritan who understood how to respond to the gift of God's grace. And here's where we could start to follow these breadcrumbs. Maybe it's a coincidence that Naaman, the chief of a foreign army, and the Samaritan leper, the offspring of a Hebrew woman centuries ago and an invading army, are presented to us to be read together. Or maybe Naaman himself, 8 centuries before our gospel passage, experienced the transforming power of grace in his life and lived out that grace until the day he died. What if Naaman continued to worship this one true God of Israel despite his Syrian surroundings? What if he got others on board and perhaps even a community in Syria began to see God this way and did the same generation after generation? It is entirely possible that this grace that Naaman received from God did not terminate on himself. True grace never does. Perhaps he received this grace, was transformed by it, and began to live it out towards others, so that one day, 8 centuries down the road, some Samaritan people were ready to see Jesus for who he truly is, perhaps even better than many of Jesus' own people did. The remainder of our liturgy this morning is really an attempt to provide opportunities for us to live out all that we just read and heard. The Eucharist, this great thanksgiving, is an offering of gratitude on our part for the grace God has given us. It is a recognition that only unlikely candidates for grace can receive grace. We will pray together, "We are not worthy to come to this your table." But the Eucharist is also a request to God to continue to give us what we need through this sacrament in order to be sent out into the world in peace, to give us the strength and courage we need to take inward grace, allow it to transform us, and then live that grace outwardly in the world. So come forward this morning. Come forward with surprise and thanksgiving in your heart that God's grace was offered even to you. But then leave this place empowered to walk in that grace as you encounter all sorts of people, worthy and unworthy, this week. Amen.